Okay, thank you very much. Welcome to the interview. I have been looking forward to this. Thank you so much for taking your time out of your schedule. So, before we begin, would you like to take your time to introduce yourself a bit? Tell us a bit about your artistic journey, your background, and how you became the artist that you are today.
These are super complicated questions because how an artist is formed, I'm probably now, I don't like to count the years, but I'm about 20 years into my art career, such as it is. And looking all the way back to where it started, I think it's really difficult to draw a line to where I am now. And I think a lot of artists probably share this in that I started out, like my first drawing experiences that I remember, that I have like a good, clear memory of, was that my brother was a graffiti writer, a graffiti artist. And he's about 6 years older than I am. And I would sneak into his room when he wasn't there. And I would take his sketchbooks. And then I would go and I would like do drawings of his drawings. In a way, it's almost a kind of a master study kind of situation. Except, of course, he was very good for what he was. Perhaps a master would be overstating it. But I spent many years in that world, in graffiti for most of my youth and my young adulthood. In fact, by the time I even went to college, I would still also do like illegal graffiti on the side of my studies. It was just something that I grew up in, that I think I still kind of hold with me aesthetically. Even though, looking at my work, would you ever know that I started out as a graffiti writer? I don't think so. It's so far off, right? Yeah.
It's funny because like a lot of artists, I was reading The Art of Prism by Yana Bogach, and a lot of artists I find tend to have like it's sometimes they get into art from like these like crazy like different aspects. It's like, oh, I came from graphic design, or I came from computer science. I had a background in this, and it's like, here you had a background in graffiti. I know because I've watched some of your I watched your interview with Proco, so like a few years back. So, but like it's still very like fascinating to hear that because of like the like how different both areas of art are, but at the same time it's all form of expression, right? And you kind of like found your way into like the classical arts and everything. Which, can you talk a bit more about that? How you kind of had that transition for you, and tell us a bit about the transition from graffiti art to the kind of art you create now.
Yeah, the transition from graffiti to, I guess, what I do now, we're going to call it fine art, classical art, something like that. That transition happened, I think, almost like in a blink of an eye, because I was in college. I was, I think, searching around for some kind of way to represent the world. Graffiti, of course, is very graphic and it doesn't have a lot of like representation. You're not going to have a lot of portraits that look like portraits. Of course, maybe there's some small amount of that, but I think the vast majority of graffiti is much more stylized and much more about text than it is about pictures of people or the world around you. So in college, I started painting stuff that looks like stuff. I started painting portraits, not very well. And a friend of mine who was also in college, a roommate of mine, he applied to this school called the Florence Academy of Art in Italy. By the way, I was working at Subway making sandwiches for like $5.25 an hour. And he's applying to this school in Italy and saying, oh, you should apply with me. And I'm like, how on earth do you possibly imagine that anything is going to come out of this application? Even if we were lucky enough, and it was a very small school, especially at the time, it was even smaller than it is now. Even if you were admitted, the idea, like a plane ticket, I had never traveled intercontinentally. So it all seemed like a pretty far off dream. A year later, I was living at an art center down south in Miami, and he got an email. He was living there as well. He got an email accepting him to the school. I got an email the same day accepting me, and I don't know how we managed to scrabble together enough money, and I started my first term in Florence. By the time you start in a program like that, you've moved an ocean away from anything that you recognize of your life, and you're immersed in a city, Florence, that is absolutely the still beating heart of the Renaissance. and you're spending 6 to 8 hours a day in a studio drawing from life, it's hard not to immediately make a transition out of whatever you were doing before into kind of absorbing the values of the world that you'd come into now. So when I say the transition was fast, it was incredibly quick because I was totally immersed in that. And also there's a certain amount of emotional buy-in that you have, right? I knew how hard it was to paint people, and have it look the way I wanted it to look. And this was a school where I saw instructors that could do that. Instructors that proved in their work that they could create that translation between reality and a painting that I was completely unable to make at the time. And so it's just a matter of a little bit of faith, a lot of buy-in, and then total immersion into that program.
Definitely. It's crazy how like one's life can just like change in the blink of an eye because, you're doing this today and then tomorrow is like, especially now with like the rise of social media and like, so many opportunities out there. Some people are like, oh, maybe I just post this on Instagram. And before you know it, they're like working in their dream studio that they never assumed or expected to ever work in their lives. It's just amazing. I love hearing like stories of artists because it's always so interesting to see like their backgrounds and how they got to where they are. It's always sometimes very it's a weird journey for everyone, and I think more than anything that is what makes me even drawn to their art more. How did you get here? How did you get to this art style? How did you become who you are? I genuinely enjoy learning about that. And in some way, I'm gonna try to make this some sort of poetic transition into the book. It's like portraiture, right? Like drawing people is something that everyone as a child, that's it, the first thing you kind of do when you pick up your pencil. At least for me, most people, right? Most kids, it's like drawing faces, humans, eyes. It's probably because that's the most relatable thing to us humans. Looking at faces, and it's also one of the thing that I think a lot of people struggle with the most. It's like we try to perfect it, or like we have this idea that we want it to look in a certain way, but we struggle the most because it's such a a complex form to you have to grasp value, anatomy, form. It's so much, and I'm so grateful that there's so many resources out there, right? Like so many resources that can help you other than trying to struggle up at yourself trying to learn it, right? And so for now we are 3 total releasing this new book. It's all about portraiture, right? And thankfully we had you contribute to this book, which amazing. I'm just so excited for the book. I can't wait to get my hands on it and learn as much as possible. So can you tell us a bit about the book, your contribution? Just briefly explain the book to us and tell us what we can expect from this book.
So I'll give you a little bit the backstory because when COVID hit, my wife and I left. We had taught at the Florence. Well, let me start that over. I'll give you a bit of background on how the idea for the book came about in the first place. From about 2007 till 2020, my wife and I taught at the Florence Academy of Art, which a lot of generations of really talented students go through. During that time, we also taught workshops around the world, in the States, throughout Europe, and worked with so many students of different skill levels as well. So in workshops, you have students that are coming in. Sometimes they barely have experience picking up a pencil. A lot of times, students at the academy had been drawing for years at the top of their class, and then they came to another place that was like an incubator for people that are great elsewhere and all come together to try and be the best in this new kind of world, this new environment. During that time, it occurred I need to backtrack. So then COVID hits and we leave the academy, we move to Norway, and I stopped teaching in person, whether in workshops or at an atelier, for about 3.5 years. So I had a lot of time to kind of clear my head from all the experiences I'd had leading up to that. Then last summer, I taught a workshop in Rome for, again, the first time in ages. And I feel like I was very fresh about what I wanted to do in that workshop. And a lot of the things that I thought you could bring to workshop students that was really important. So when workshop students come in, and let's just say like beginning students, one of the big issues that they have is an issue of confidence. They're not really sure how to get the vision out of their head and onto a paper. They're not really sure how the materials are going to work. They're not sure how to create a smooth gradation or an even value. They're not sure how to render the planes of the nose. There's so many unknowns for them, right? And so I realized that actually there's kind of two things that need to happen. One, we need to obviously draw a portrait. And the second is we need to imbue that person with the confidence to make good artistic decisions that will lead to a great portrait. Now, confidence is an interesting thing, and if you study behavioral psychology, you'll come across ideas. One of the ones that I thought that was so significant was that confidence is developed through gaining, or rather gathering evidence. And I thought this was fascinating, right? Now, as an artist, one of the things that you do a lot is you make studies. You make preparatory studies, compositional studies, structural studies, anatomical studies in the act or in the preparation for making like some grand artwork. And I thought, no, this is perfect. So how does a student of drawing, gather the evidence to have the confidence to make a great portrait drawing? Well, they make studies. So what I wanted to do in the book was combine these two things. Making tons of studies to imbue the student with confidence to make a great portrait drawing, which is what I demonstrate in the last section of the book. That's the idea in a nutshell. All the studies that we go through go from studying the basics of the materials and how to look at light and how to look at form. We go through anatomy for portrait artists. We go through several different kinds of studies, from studying the planes and structure of the face to studying the dynamics of light in a portrait. All the things that I thought of that you could stuff into that category of preparing students to make great portrait drawings is in the first 2 or 3 sections of the book. And then in the final section, I go through my process. I share everything that I do in the lead up to making one of my portrait drawings.
That's very interesting because, a lot of people don't talk about, like, this is my first time hearing, like, about, like, bringing confidence into art, because maybe, I don't know if most artists can, like, relate to this, but when I make work that I go into and I'm not that confident about it, I tend to, like, struggle a lot with the process, because at the back of my head, I'm like, what am I doing? I don't know what process do I use? How do I get this certain, like, look and effect? And I'm constantly, like, at the back of my head, not even concentrating on what I'm doing, because I don't know what I'm doing. I've already made up my mind that, like, I have no idea what I'm doing, right? But I find it that, like, when I'm going to something that's, like, more familiar and I'm more confident, it's like, oh, I can do this in my sleep, right? It's the process a lot smoother. I make more. I'm also open to, like, make a lot more like creative decisions on the fly. I'm like, okay, well, I haven't tried that, but, like, I could try that, and I find that, like, it's good. It works out. It's very interesting to me. I absolutely love that. And, I think the idea of, like, studies. I personally am an art student myself, so I love studying the fundamentals. I love, like, I believe, like, practice definitely helps to improve, and I love the idea that the book takes you from, like, okay, so this is how you understand this, and finally now make something with that, right? Like, and you can see how you can also see the progress of how, okay, this was where I was when I started off, and now this is what I can make with all this information. I absolutely love that. I think that's very interesting take on the book, honestly. I wanted to also ask, because when you mentioned, like, obviously, like, you've taught different, like, students from different skill sets. What is the most common mistake you tend to see, like, people make when it comes to drawing portraits?
There's got to be a dozen most common ones. I mean, this is the problem with answering that question. It's kind of like 10 of them just leap to mind immediately. One of the ones that I think is most critical in determining failure or progress is to be patient, not really even necessarily just with the process, but with yourself. So when students come to drawing, they're learning what the landscape of drawing is about, and learning about what it's like to actually learn something. Now, when I started out at 24, I used to skateboard. So in one way, I was aware of how long it takes to, like, learn a series of tricks to get your muscle memory in your body to do something so that you don't actually have to think when you're doing it. Going into drawing, I believe that this informed my understanding of how long this process was going to take to go from start to excellence or mastery of the craft, or whatever we want to call it. Students come in, learn about the drawing landscape, and they haven't familiarized themselves with the idea of how long this is going to take. So they expect one drawing, two drawings to see the progress that they're going to make. And they use those drawings, they use those two drawings that they've done to determine whether or not they feel like they'll be a success. 10 drawings, 20 drawings, 30 drawings, and drawings made in a quick succession, not drawings that take 30, 40 hours to make, short drawings. In the initial part of your education, the curve is going to be steep, but it requires repetition. So the more that you repeat, the more that you iterate, the faster that progress is going to be. Now later on, once you've done 10, 20, 30 portrait drawings, I think you can think about starting to take a little bit more time to invest 10, 20 hours into a portrait drawing, get into the finer, aspects of shading and form and volume and impression. That's when you start to invest that kind of time. So I think one of the mistakes is not having enough patience with themselves and understanding also the arc that they're going to be on in terms of their sort of student journey.
I agree, because this, I don't know if you hear online a lot the saying where people my biggest red flag is I expect to be a master right off the bat. Sure. Right? It's you start off, and I think also with the internet, everyone is afraid to come off as a noob or a beginner or not good enough. Yeah. So you don't want to no one wants to accept the student phase. We want to be pro instantly, and the reality is that's just not how it's gonna work. Yeah. Especially when it comes to art, this is a thing that's gonna go on for a long time, yeah. Right? And I definitely agree that it's a lot of people tend to. I have a lot of friends who we all drew together in school, and I think I'm one of the only remaining artists right now, because a lot of people were just and it's funny because some of these people I looked up to, and now it's wow, okay, I definitely agree. I think we should everyone actually, not just beginners, need to understand there is that learning curve, and it's not even just once you get the curve. I think it's always ongoing, because the point where you get I forget how it goes specifically, but your eye your eye can see your mistakes faster than your hand can actually make it. So you're at this point where you're in your head, you want to be better than what you're producing, and you struggle to before you can actually reach that point. Okay, finally. Yeah. And it's this constant never ending flow of trying to always understand that this is a journey and not just a one point destination, right? Yeah. I definitely agree. Yeah. So I wanted to ask also, when it comes to the book, right? There's so much we can expect, right? I want to know what's your favorite, actually, let me backtrack. What was your favorite parts of working on the book?
Your video is
also,
froze
what do
for
you
a second
think
there, but go ahead, sorry.
Oh, you can hear me now, right? Perfect. My bad, sorry. I was asking 2 questions in one, kinda, or you can answer this how you want to. What was your favorite part working on the book? What chapter personally do you resonate with the most? But also, what chapter do you think is the most important chapter? Okay, this is if for any reason you're gonna sell this book to someone, right? You're a salesman, I need to sell this book. What's the key element? This, right? If not for any reason, get this book for this, right? Yeah. So
Well, my favorite part of the book overall was, I don't know if it's a favorite part of the book, but my favorite part of the process of making the book was when I was planning out in the beginning and sort of shuffling around the ideas for different chapters and different content that I was going to make. And I realized that I wanted the book not only to be instructional, because of course it's a book that's designed to take you from the very start of your drawing experience all the way to what you can potentially expect, as you become a professional. But I realized that I didn't just want to tell the information, just say what was there. if you'll allow me the digression, right?
Yep, take your time.
When you're a student, when you're a student in a classical atelier, you do drawings of plaster casts. Those plaster casts in general are not modern sculptures. They're antique, classical, Greek, Roman sculptures. And the question comes up for students a lot, why? I mean, I think these 19th century casts are more beautiful. Why are we studying these antique ones that seem more generic, more simple? The answer that comes to students is not a satisfying one for them, but ultimately it's a really, really cool thing. It's because when we draw, say, the features of Michelangelo's David, there's a famous cast of David's eye that I did when I was a student. When you draw from something that Michelangelo created, locked up in that plaster cast is an aesthetic message as well, an artistic message in the choices that he's made, the forms that he's created, right? So you're traveling through time to access his artistic sensibilities when you're studying that plaster cast. You can't do that with certainly like a life cast or any old chunk of plaster. It's not the same. We're trying to access the, secrets, right, of the oldest masters in the business. So when I was making my book, I'm not Michelangelo by any stretch of the imagination, but I understood the entirety of the book, every page of it, also has to have an aesthetic message. So if I'm going to make anatomical diagrams, I want those to be the absolute most beautiful anatomical diagrams that I can. If I'm going to show you how to make studies of a sphere, I want the sphere that I'm drawing from to be the most beautiful, attractive source that I can take, and the drawing should be finely rendered. So I tried to make, start to finish, a book that has, yes, a lot of information that'll help you to become a better artist, but also hopefully carried forward my aesthetic ideas, how I think when I'm making artwork, and what my vision is for how to perceive the world and how to render the world in graphite.
Definitely, I love that because I'm a huge advocate for like art books, and I also feel like art books themselves are also like a form of expression. I love 3D Total's books specifically because like before I started working with them, I was a huge backer of almost all their books, and I just love how you can kind of like each book you can kind of feel an artist's like choice of expression, like regardless of like where it's like it's just I think more than anything, art is a form of expression, and as artists we love looking at things that like I think we can feel it, right, when there's someone pours their soul into something. And I absolutely love that. I love that you try to like put your own like artistic spin, your own form of expression into this book. I think that's more than anything makes it not feel like a generic textbook. At least it's like more than that, right? That's the idea. This is exactly. So I love that. Yeah. Perfect. And about the selling point for the book, what would you say is like? Okay, this chapter is the chapter that I think, or this is the most important chapter, or I know as a whole the book is definitely going to be packed with like information. But what do you think like you're most excited for people to see in this book, like?
All right, it's just super boring. I'm going to give you the most boring answer I possibly can because I think it's going to be a very underrated section of the book that I actually think is the most important, right? So we've all been in this situation where we're making a drawing and we start to question the validity of it. We question the merit of it. We question whether it's good enough. We question whether it matters. All of these things that I just mentioned are the reasons why people stop making a drawing. I've stopped making tons of artwork. I started a painting out. I thought it was a good idea, and I lost faith at a certain point. Right. This is an enormous problem for artists. It's a problem I experience. I know I'm just like everybody else. We all kind of go through it. These crisis of belief. In the first section of the book, which is called Vision, I talk about the value system that I have, what I believe makes my art worth making, right? And this is a personal message from me, but I think also it's adaptable to many people. You can have values that are completely different and also totally valid. But the point is, I tried to carve out a conceptual purpose, a reason that we do this in the first place. What are we making these drawings for, and why is it valid? Why is it important? Why should we, when we feel that friction trying to stop us from finishing because we lose belief, why should we continue forward, right? Because that belief, I think, is the thing that differentiates from people that stop working to people that continue because they believe in their mission, they believe in their journey, and they believe in the work that they're making. So the whole first section I talk about why we even draw in the first place. What is the point of it? And how do we understand what our values actually are?
Definitely. I think that's a very, you said it's might be underrated, but like I disagree. When in school you're learning something and your teacher's like, this is important, listen up, and you're like, nah, this isn't important. And then years later you're like, I see. Okay, like the most important thing, that information is there. Even if you don't understand it at that moment, you don't value it at that moment, you feel like, oh, this is not important, or I think this is boring. As long as it's there at the back of your head, when the time comes where you're gonna like, oh, I get it now, it's you can pull from that eventually. So I think that's a very solid. Not at all. For me personally, think that's valid.
Now the ones that I think that will be most popular, I think the anatomy section is going to be hugely popular because we worked really, really hard on making those renders as beautiful as we possibly could. And the rest of the drawing, I literally made all new content for the book from start to finish. So every drawing that you see, well, not every drawing, almost every drawing that you see in that book is made specifically for that book. I worked so hard on it. It's filled to the brim with what I think are some of the most beautiful drawings that I've made.
So it's also kind of like a stunning gallery of Stephen's work. If you want to just like flip through my selling point for this book is you want to look at stunning art from Stephen, just flip through it. Just get it for that reason alone. Perfect. I absolutely love that. We're coming to the end of the interview slowly, but before we go, I have a few more questions. Firstly, this kind of like ties into what we're talking about like people who, but who would you recommend this book to? Like beginner or intermediate or even beyond that, who would you recommend this book to? Someone who maybe just
Yeah. One of the things I became deeply aware of when I started working and teaching online was that there's way more people starting out than there are experts. At this point, I decided I need to be there for that community, for the community of people that is broad and that needs access to the tools that are going to get them eventually to being very good. Once you're at your intermediate stage, once you're at the expert stage, you have a foundation that hopefully, if that foundation was built right, will propel you towards better work as you go. It's that beginning stage where we're forming our values, where we're forming the foundation for our practices that I think it's just so important. And I made the book, I think, mostly for those people. Now, if you're an intermediate drawing student and you feel like you have a reasonable foundation and you want to take it to the next stage, or you want to know what a professional artist does when they're preparing to make their work, that's in the book as well. So I think it's accessible to a variety of ranges, but I really try to keep a beginner in mind. Really, when I make my video lessons, when I wrote this book, all the time I'm thinking, what does that student need? And also, how can I speak to that level? One of the very conscious choices I made, and this is, I think it's kind of funny, because there's a very divisive word, shading. Now, inside the atelier world where you're working at these very high level schools, you will never hear it in the corridors. Nobody says shading. They say modeling form, they say rendering, they have a lot of very specific words that they use to do that, right? Now here's the thing. Outside of that world, literally everybody says shading. So there's this disconnect in between like the deep academic intellectual world and what really like everybody who's trying to access it says. So when I talk about it, I talk about shading because I want to meet people where they're at. I don't want to talk over anybody's head. I want the information that I think is good to also be accessible. Because if it's not accessible, I don't know what we're doing here.
I agree. I definitely agree. I have a YouTube channel, and I think one of my most commonly asked questions are like from beginners always saying, I see a lot of videos, but it's not beginner friendly, right? Like I see this and it's not big. I see a lot of that, and it's like, how do you know which videos are beginner friendly, or I don't understand this, or it's like I was watching this and it felt like it wasn't made for me. So I definitely think that like dedicated books to actually help everyone, especially people who are starting off. Because I think, like you said, they're the ones who are looking for this information the most, right? They kind of like, I think intermediate artists are a bit more specific. They kind of like, oh, I know what I want. I'm more picky when picking, but like beginners are like, I have no idea where to start. And it's funny how like there isn't enough resources out there for them, to actually start, right? So I definitely think that was a very very solid decision to make it. And also, like I said, I think as artists in general, one of my beliefs is that we're all students. We're always learning, and like you can never like learn more than you think, right? So even if you feel like, oh no, I'm not a beginner, right? Like most times you pick up a book and that's tailored for beginners, and you learn something that you're like, oh shit, well I didn't know about that, and that's one thing I love about like this field, I guess, this art field. It's like you can never stop learning something, and it's just beautiful. And definitely I love that. So we've come to the final questions. This is just like a general advice you would have for not only beginner artists but aspiring artists and just artists early on in their art journey. What advice would you have for them?
Again, really tough questions. I think that if I could give an advice that I thought would actually be taken up, I would say that remember, if you're going to really enjoy what you're doing, you should do your best to make art not a procedure, but a search. When I'm making work, I always have some vision that I think is a little bit past where I'm able to be. And I'm trying while I work to figure out how to bridge the gap in between the two. This is what I attribute all of the progress that I've made since being a student to, is that I've always been curious. I've always been searching for what element I can bring into my work that's going to make it richer, deeper, more interesting, more fun for myself to do.
Very important.
On the other side of that, if you make artwork a procedure, that something that goes through a series of rigid steps that you simply reproduce over and over, as I say it, you can hear how that could become boring, and how your mission could become listless and uninteresting to you. So be a searcher, don't be a producer.
Lovely advice. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the interview. Like I said, cannot wait for the book. I'm sure it's going to be jam-packed with so much information that I personally, I'm ready to learn. So thank you so much, Stephen. I really, really do appreciate it. Thank you for your time. This is a lovely conversation today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.